Hey everyone, and welcome to this 21st episode of the Roundtable Discussions produced by Transparent Media Truth. This episode was recorded on October 27th, 2020. Today, we welcome Misty Winston and Jesse Zurawell from the up-and-coming news and information podcast, Facts on the Ground. Together, Misty and Jesse represent the next generation of independent media arising largely in response to the persecution of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and the realization that mainstream media outlets have been conspicuously negligent in its coverage of the Assange extradition trial, with little to no mention of its impacts on journalism specifically and freedom of speech worldwide. As a result of the lack of mainstream support for Assange, many journalists are waking up to the concerning aspects of mainstream media coverage that often conflates outright corporate and government propaganda with actual news reporting. The persecution of Assange exposes the larger issue of a mainstream involved in covering up not only the silencing of a journalist, but also the corporate and government crimes that journalist brought into the light. The Assange rabbit hole not only reveals corporate journalistic malfeasance, but also provides the independent journalist insight into the extent of the damage caused by the U.S. empire worldwide. This damage remains absent from the corporate media narrative concerning U.S. foreign policy, and even extends into the realm of domestic policy where government corporate crimes are often whitewashed and truth obfuscated for the benefit of the few who reside atop the corporate hierarchy. Stay tuned for this conversation with Misty and Jesse concerning the state of independent media today as we struggle to inform our audience in the face of imperialist aggression, misinformation, and censorship. Find out more about Facts on the Ground on YouTube or at FOTG Podcast on Twitter. I will be your host. My name is Doug McKenty. You can find my long-form interview podcast, The Shift with Doug McKenty, on YouTube and Facebook, at DMcKenty on Twitter, and you can check out all my work on the web at www.theshiftnow.com. As always, I'd like to thank producer Rob Rubin for putting this episode together. Find all the roundtable discussions at Transparent Media Truth on YouTube or www.transparentmediatruth.com on the web. You can contact Rob directly on Twitter at TransparentMed1. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast, as in the age of third-party platform shadow banning and outright censorship, we rely on listeners like yourselves to get the word out. Enjoy this episode of the Roundtable Discussions featuring Misty Winston and Jesse Zurawell of Facts on the Ground. Hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Roundtable Discussions. Today I am joined with Misty Winston and Jesse Zurawell of the Facts on the Ground podcast. They are doing a podcast. I think it started with the Julian Assange movement and then has now kind of spread into all of investigative journalism, and they have a lot of young independent journalists on their show. So I'm excited to talk about the state of investigative journalism, and especially get their perspective on the new generation of journalists that are coming out and the perspectives that they are promoting in terms of how we can get this information out there in an independent and non-corporate way, and how we can express and voice our opinions in this age where the internet censorship is getting so bad that we're having a hard time getting the word out. But welcome to the program, Misty and Jesse. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Doug.
You want to just, I'll go to Misty first and talk a little bit about your history and why you got into this, and tell us the story about getting Facts on the Ground together.
Well, I guess I got kind of into activism, just sort of through life in general. I never really considered myself an activist. I always kind of, I was more associated with like mutual aid type stuff. I'd go to some protests here and there, but I would say I probably got really amped up into being more actively involved probably around 2009, once I realized that Obama was, a corporate sellout. And so,
Right.
yeah, that kind of got me riled up. And, at that time I just had my first child. So that really kind of made me, start paying more attention to the things that were going on in the world. But just as far as like getting involved in the Julian Assange case and stuff, I had been following WikiLeaks since, the collateral murder video and the Iraq war logs and all that stuff came out. I was a supporter of theirs. I, donated, bought merchandise, all that stuff, but I wasn't like super involved until I would say probably when Chelsea Manning was arrested. I followed that trial and everything, and that kind of amped up my involvement in the case and all of that stuff. And then I really got involved once they started really heavily going after Julian Assange. I realized at that point that it was a really dire issue. And so that's kind of how I got involved in the Assange movement. It's just kind of snowballed since then. I've kind of become a little obsessive about it. But as far as facts on the ground, it's actually kind of a funny story. Jesse invited me on. He had already started a show, and he invited me on to discuss the Julian Assange case. And so I went on, and we had a great conversation. And then a couple of days later, he messaged me and said that Max Blumenthal had contacted him, had watched the show, thought we had good chemistry, and suggested that we started a show. And so we did. And here we are.
Awesome. Very cool. And Jesse, a little bit of your history. Why did you start the show? Yeah.
Well, before I get into that, I'll just briefly describe how I came to political awareness, if you will. Mm-hmm. I didn't know much of anything until around 2006, and what's happening with what's commonly referred to as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is, in my opinion, a whitewash, but that's a different conversation. For some reason, that flipped a switch in me, and I realized that I didn't know much about anything that was happening in the world as far as the US's forever wars, as far as its imperialism, as far as its support for Israel, as far as the history of Palestinians being essentially exterminated under the Israeli boot. And I just started reading as much as I could find and talking to people who were active in pro-Palestinian movements, in BDS movements. And one of I'd say probably the most catalyzing event for me was the war Israel waged on Lebanon in 2006, and witnessing on TV. This was back when CNN still had a modicum of respectability, and there were journalists like Ben Wiedemann and Hala Garani who were on the ground in Lebanon and discussing and detailing just the carnage that Israel wreaked on the Lebanese civilian population, including shelling husbands and wives and blowing fetuses out of pregnant wives' stomachs. And it struck up for me what was for me a very powerful question. What the hell is going on out there? Why is this happening? And I just kept reading more and trying to inform myself. And fast forward to now, or this year, starting a podcast or a show is something that I had been thinking about for a while. And I still think I'm a rookie when it comes to Twitter and advertising myself on social media, whatever you want to call it. But I thought I'll just throw my hat in the ring and see if anybody responds, and try to start talking about issues that aren't, if they're not being covered, they're barely being covered. And I'm still lost somewhere on the learning curve, but it just felt like an intuitive, a natural thing to do. I've read and accumulated this knowledge, and I have, you could call them opinions or points of view, but what I really saw was this huge gap that I'm sure we'll talk about more especially in independent media. And I'm not trying to be the savior who completely fills the gap, but I felt like I had a voice to add to that, and that's what I'm trying to do. And after I got lucky, I would say, the first few guests were Max Blumenthal was one of the first few guests, and he's just been very encouraging to me. And as Misty said, he suggested after our interview, after Misty and I spoke to one another, that we team up and do the show. And I thought that was a good idea. I proposed it to Misty. She was down, and we just rolled from there. But as you said earlier, a lot of our focus has been on Assange, and I think rightfully so. But we're also trying to cover stories that you just won't hear about if you're a normal person who's tuned into mainstream media. And that's not to criticize those people or fault them, but essentially it's trying to fill a gap and give people information that they're not going to access otherwise, and hopefully do something to enhance humanity in our own little way.
Absolutely. At what point do you think, I mean, I'm presuming that, like myself, I used to ingest a lot of the corporate media, and then there came a point, and I actually, because I'm kind of a research nerd, I mean, I spent a lot of time comparing and contrasting. I'll tell you this story just to preface this conversation, because right when the fake news meme probably first started coming out, like 2015, 2016, and the Russian propaganda thing started rolling out, and I had already been reading a lot of independent media and comparing them to corporate media, but I kind of gave them equal weight. But when the fake news thing started coming out, I was like, well, what is all this? We can talk about the Atlantic Council that I think started a lot of that. I know you guys, I just love talking. The more we can wake people up to what the Atlantic Council does, I think the better off everyone will be. But, they were pushing the Russian propaganda meme, and there was this website, Propernaut, that came out, and I would be talking to people, and I'd be like, check out this source. And they'd say, well, that's on Propernaut, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. That's Russian propaganda. So I spent a lot of time comparing and contrasting corporate media sources to independent media sources. And I was just flabbergasted at how many corporate media sources, like there would have one source, and then 200 articles would come out. It would be the only article that you could read on the internet, but they all had the same source, and you trace the source back, and it's like an anonymous member of the intelligence community.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that happened over and over again. And then I would go to independent news sources, like the sources listed on Propernaut, and they would actually have real investigative journalism where they'd source their material. You could look and check the primary sources, and they were actual human beings or documentation, And I suddenly came to the realization, it just took me a long time. That's the thing about recognizing that so much that's coming out of the corporate media space is just nonsense. Literally, like it's terribly sourced. There may be one source. They're not comparing information. It's obviously a push narrative throughout the entire network of hundreds of news sources that are pumping out the same stuff, even though the source material is not really there. So will you talk about your process, I think, coming to understand that? I mean, did you have a similar experience? Was there a growth process growing out of the corporate media and then starting to appreciate the work of the independent investigative journalists that are out there? I guess, Misty, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I guess I watched. I mean, honestly, I was never much of a news watcher until probably around like 2006, 2007. I was really kind of more involved in like my local stuff than I was really. I mean, like I didn't really care about voting. I didn't really care about politics. I, just involved myself in local stuff and some activism, and that was about it. I've always been very skeptical of electoral politics and that whole system. So, I did watch CNN, pretty regularly there for a while. That was kind of my go-to source. Some MSNBC, but I would say, but about the same time that I realized that Barack Obama was, a joke, that's about the same time that I realized that mainstream media was a joke, because it was, very kind of intertwined. They were covering for him. They were, so it kind of came to me all at one time. I've always been a fan of alternative sources. And so, that's always kind of been something that I've supplemented my, informational input with. But I would say that I really started to recognize the value of good independent journalism probably around 2010, 2011, somewhere in there, about the same time as WikiLeaks. The collateral murder video came out. And so I think that, my process was, pretty gradual, I would say, of kind of recognizing that mainstream media was not to be trusted. But I think that it also comes with knowing that, you have 5 or 6 corporations controlling 90% of your media. And, you're never going to get factual information when 5 people are controlling what you're allowed to know. And so I think that, it's great to be having these conversations, to be talking about the Atlantic Council, to be talking about the mainstream media and the source or the kind of media environment that we find ourselves in. Because, I've said this, my friend Steve Poikonen says this all the time, the United States is by far the most propagandized country on earth. And, I think that mainstream media and the battle for narrative is the front line of all other fights that we face. And so, this is kind of the issue of the day, I think. And so, it's great to be having these conversations. I wish more people would be having them. So, I don't know Jesse's process and how he kind of came to terms with all of that.
Right. That's amazing. Let me just interject here, Jesse, for a second about that idea of being propagandized, because I think most Americans, I think personally, the propaganda is so good here that Americans don't know they're being propagandized. And just to make that leap to say, oh, what's all this corporate junk news that's coming our way? And then to be able to say, well, this is what they call propaganda. People come to me with, sources like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I almost wish, I want to say to them, would you listen to Pravda in the Soviet Union? And I'm sure the response would be very confusing, but they don't get that there is some kind of a corporate narrative that's then driven through all of these networks. So anyway, Jesse, do you want to kind of discuss your awareness of this process and what happened to you to make you want to get involved in the independent investigative journalism scene?
Sure. It coincided with what I mentioned earlier, the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006, and also discovering Robert Fisk's work at the same time, and reading both his book on Lebanon, Pity the Nation, and his last book, The Great War for Civilization, both of which are massive books. But I think if you're going to want to school yourself on what's really happening, particularly in the Middle East, with regard to U.S. imperialism and Israeli and Saudi proxies, they're invaluable books and worth spending the time reading. And it gave me a different point of view of journalism than what I had been used to, which was whatever at that time, essentially, my parents were watching on television. It would be usually Fox or CNN or MSNBC.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes CNBC, which I don't consider is not a journalistic outlet, but it's sort of the financial arm of MSNBC, I suppose you could say. And reading Fisk's work taught me that the idea of 50-50 journalism, of going to journalism school and learning how to produce journalism, is complete bullshit. And it's especially bullshit when it comes to a situation like the Middle East. If you just want to take the Middle East in totality.
Can you explain what 50-50 journalism means?
So this idea that you're supposed to be objective and give both sides of the story. And Fisk has made this argument many times quite cogently and powerfully, and I think rightly, that when you're reporting on something like the Middle East, where it's a hell disaster and there are obviously victims and perpetrators, it's immoral, I would even say, to give 50-50, to give equal amounts of coverage to both sides. So for example, if you're covering I'll cite his example. If you're covering a suicide bombing in Jerusalem, you're not going to give 50% of your piece to Hamas or whoever might have been behind the bombing, and then 50% to the victims. You're going to tell the victim story. You're not reporting on a football match. So it seems like a pretty simple and intuitive idea, but so many of us are conditioned to think that journalism is supposed to be this clinical, non-opinionated analysis of what's happening in the world, and that's just not true. But we're so conditioned to that, we're so used to that, that's what we get every day if we just rely on mainstream media. And reading him blew a hole in that narrative for me. And from there, I started reading other really good writers and journalists and analyzers of what's happening in the Middle East. Ali Abu Nima, Max Blumenthal, Jonathan Cook is a great resource, great journalist. And the more I learned and the more I was able to research and verify that these people aren't just putting their opinions out. They've been on the ground. They've seen what's happened. They know history. It was pretty easy once that all set in to realize that mainstream media is bullshit. And at this point, it's not about news. At best, it's about infotainment. And at worst, it's about business and revenue. And I don't know if General Electric still owns MSNBC or NBC, but say that's still the case, or it was the case, NBC is not going to run a story that's critical of the arms industry when General Electric is a huge producer of armaments in the United States. So I still watch those channels, but it's my philosophy with it is to know your enemies. These are people pushing ideologies and narratives that I think are dangerous and false. I think a lot of us who even pay a minimum amount of attention can see that. And I also realize too that as far as independent journalists go, or dissenting journalists, there are a lot more out there than one would know initially. And I've just been gravitating mostly toward their work for information on what's happening. So not to fanboy too much on Robert Fisk, but the man actually goes to places on the ground. He goes to where things are supposed to have happened. For example, when there was the non-existent chemical attack in Douma, Syria in early 2018, which was used as justification to launch airstrikes against Syria, he went there shortly afterward. He said he had no problem being let into the area by the Syrian government. And when he talked to people, most of the people didn't know what he was talking about. They had no idea that this propaganda vehicle, this visual propaganda vehicle, essentially had been orchestrated and used to try to justify attacking Syria militarily. And
right.
I think that, I know journalists on mainstream media networks, they don't do that. The closest you'll see is Anderson Cooper reporting from the hills of Jerusalem as bombs rain down on Gaza. So it was easy once I saw through. It was a process. It was a lengthy process, I would say, to see through the bullshit. But once I did, it was very easy to identify it and kind of put it in its place for what it was, and then sort of analyze and deconstruct it after reading independent sources, more reliable sources that actually travel to the sites where these things happen and talk to people who actually live there.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I've actually been focusing on this concept of cognitive dissonance lately, where because people are so, I mean, what we're discussing as propaganda, they think is this great. We live in this free society with a free press, even though they're not paying attention to the Assange trial at all, and but they still, nonetheless, they believe this, and they see 100 news sites, and it doesn't really sink in that 5 people own all 100 or 200, or it's 90% of the media that people ingest. So they can't see that there's a common thread between all of the narratives that are coming out by these handful of major corporations, like you were talking about, Jesse. Every single one of which has massive contracts with the defense industry, so huge conflicts of interest in terms of any one of those journalists or the editorial boards that work for these corporations.
And just to interject real quick, it's not just American media either. Le Figaro, the French newspaper, is owned by a French armaments industry, so it's a global problem.
Well, it's so much money that's spent on the defense industry. It's just so much money that even the advertisers on these corporate outlets are all, embroiled in conflicts of interest, because all the advertisers make most of their money, much if not most, from the defense industry. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars a year that are getting spent. And it's not just armaments, it's the medical community, it's the people that build the ships, it's the steel industry, it's the certainly the bankers are heavily invested, and the oil industry, right? And so we're looking at not only the corporations that own the media, but also all the advertisers in the media are funneling money, billions and billions of dollars each year into these corporate outlets. I mean, you can see they call it a conspiracy, right? Even though it's right in front of your face. And that's what's so amazing. Let's discuss this. Do you guys get frustrated? Because I know I do, that so few people can see this. Like, let's take your example, Jesse. Robert, the Duma thing happens. Robert Fisk goes on the ground and says, there's no chemical weapon here, right? What? Nothing happened. I'm interviewing the people here. Nobody even knows what you're talking about. Yet the United States bombed Syria, killed dozens of people, and blamed it on this thing. And then this story has dragged on to this day, years later, because the OPCW went in to study it, and they came out with something that was like, well, under a lot of pressure from the United States, of course, that tried to justify it. Yeah, we think we found some chlorine gas, some evidence that there was something there. And then you've got the whistleblowers coming out, and you can show people, well, I knew this was fake from the first day because I listened to the investigative journalist who was on the ground. 2 years later, we're still arguing with people about this, and it drives me nuts. So
hey, to be fair, though, a CNN journalist went to Syria and smelled a backpack.
Right, that's right. to give the other side, the other point of view, yeah.
Smells like something. Oh,
right, must be a
that's
chemical
journalism.
weapon.
Yeah, right. I think that the Syria thing was so obviously garbage. Assad is in a good position. He's winning the war. He's in a good place.
Right.
Trump says we're going to pull out. Everything's great. So he decides to gas his own people, which guarantees that we're going to re-engage. Well, that's ridiculous.
The narrative never made sense. It's crazy that people just absorb the information and are like, oh, those evil Syrians, Syria bad, Russia bad, Well,
that's the thing, though. That's how propaganda works. They repeat it over and over and over again, and people just take it because Rachel Maddow said it's true. So it must be true because she would never lie. It's, it's the dumbing down of America. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the problem is that these corporate media gateholders like Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity and Anderson Cooper, they're not really interested in the story, in what's happened. They're interested in maintaining their careers and presenting a narrative that allows them to maintain their careers. And I think they just as soon not cover a story like Duma if they didn't have to, if their bosses didn't say, well, we got to say something about this. And what frustrates me is that a lot of people in the US at least rely on these mainstream sources for their news, for their information about what's happening in the world. And I don't blame them or fault them for that. People have to work, people have families. We're not all able to conduct research every night when we come home from work. So there's, I think, to be fair, a unwilling amount of ignorance that a lot of Americans are susceptible to because they just don't have the time or the resources to look into what's happening. But at the same time, I think going back to Russiagate, that to me is, in my lifetime, one of the biggest, most effective and toxic propaganda campaigns I've witnessed, because it's still going on. It's still spinning out ridiculous stories that Russia was paying the Taliban, which has been grinding down U.S. forces since the war started.
We just had the story. If I can interrupt for just a second, we just had the story about the Iran-Russia influenced emails that were telling people, if they don't vote for Trump, we're going to beat you up. And it's like, what's your source? Oh, no, anonymous CIA official, It's like, how far can you stretch this and how long will people believe it? And they'll believe it forever. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah, but the frightening thing is that there are millions of Americans who believe this stuff, and they think that right now Russia is actively engaging in some kind of sabotage against the upcoming elections without proof. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a lot of people about why they dislike Trump. Is it because of his policies? Is it just his personality? Is it both? And by and large, a lot of them have told me that they just have a gut feeling that he's in bed with Russia without any kind of concrete proof. And I think that's why the Russiagate propaganda campaign has been so insanely successful and I think unprecedented, is because it's been able to convince so many people without any evidence whatsoever, even after the Mueller report came out and found nothing, after wasting 30 million of our tax dollars. They're still, it's been so ingrained in them that they can't let it go. And
I think that's actually, if I can just interrupt for a second, I think that's actually what I find more troubling is that it's not just in the absence of evidence, it's in light of evidence to the contrary. Yeah. There's plenty of evidence that there is no legitimate connection between, did he have some shady business dealings with some Russian oligarchs? I'm sure he did. What politician, what world leader, it's like a cesspool of corruption.
That's right.
They're all doing it. So Trump, that's not specific to Trump. Trump's not special. They all do that shit. So the fact that they're trying to make this a Trump issue and make it, it's beyond absurd. And so, the fact that people are believing this, a lack of evidence, but there's evidence to prove it wrong. It's been debunked over. How many bombshells do you need to have debunked before it sets in that this is crap? It's really frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so frustrating. And then think back to where it all started with the leaked DNC emails. And what did those emails say? Well, they said that the Democratic National Committee was screwing over the Bernie Sanders campaign. So the whole thing is actually a cover-up for corruption within the Democratic Party that should have been the big issue. That's what we should all be talking about right now. Why did they steal that election?
And there's evidence to support that. That's not just hyperbole. There's evidence to support the fact that this was made up by the Democratic Party to distract people from Hillary Clinton's epic failure.
Right.
And so, we have one of our own major parties in our country starting a propaganda campaign, a years-long propaganda campaign, poking at another nuclear power to protect Hillary Clinton. And I don't know how more disturbing it could get.
It really is amazing. And not even just Hillary Clinton, but the whole Democratic Party, like rigging a primary. Like, wait a minute, that's something we need to be having a national discussion about. And I would think, actually, that Democrats would be the most upset people about this. And instead, they've fallen for, which I wanted to get into with you guys too, is that a lot of times, in order to cover for corruption, they fall, like you talk about the 50-50 journalism, but then they take the corruption and turn it into a left-right issue. This frustrates me because I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, why can't I have conversations with people like you're talking about, Misty? There's evidence. I don't care what your political affiliation is. Like, we're not talking about Republicans versus Democrats here. We're talking about, is somebody corrupt? Did somebody break the law? Is there something going down? Again, going back to your point about activist journalism, like, what is this 50-50 journalism when you're comparing a criminal and the victim? Like, let's give the criminal's point of view. This is important. We don't want to hurt his feelings. Well, no, this person is a murderer, or even a mass murderer in the case of these imperialistic wars. Like, let's have.
I think it's important to ask why the perpetrators are doing what they're doing, which, depending on the scale of the crime, could be a small or a large question. But as far as giving equal time to them to explain themselves, I don't think that is. I find that disingenuous journalism, and it's, I think, a tactic of the corporate media.
Sure.
To keep people misinformed and disinformed.
Right. And then to fold the corruption back into the left-right paradigm as well. So suddenly it's like, well, the Democrats are supposed to back Hillary Clinton and the Republicans back Trump. And so we've turned this whole thing into a political issue when it shouldn't be political. I'm finding this more and more. I mean, even the hydroxychloroquine debate, which to me should have been a scientific debate. And actually, to me, it should have been a personal choice between you and your doctor. I don't know why we had a national debate over a personal healthcare decision. But nonetheless, that we're having this national debate about this, it's politicized instead of just analyzing the science. And it's like, well, if you're a Trump supporter, you're open-minded to it. And if you're a Democrat, then you just think it's silly and, you want to go take your remdesivir or whatever. But I think it all just speaks to these 2 points. Misty, what you're talking about, like the dumbing down of people, where instead of having evidence-based conversations, we're having these political fights, and then it's creating this cognitive dissonance within people where it's hard to even have an evidence-based discussion anymore. I mean, I think this is
by design. I think it's by design. They want us divided. They want you to have a team mentality. They want it to be Democrats versus Republicans. Because if we start talking to each other and recognizing the things that we agree on, that's a problem for them. So everything has to be made hyper-partisan. And that's why, just with my Assange activism and with working with Action for Assange, my favorite thing about that group and my friends who are my activist groups, based over there, our movement is very focused on being post-partisan. We don't care who you are. We don't care what party you belong to, or if you're supporting Julian Assange and press freedom, you're on our team. And I think that that's okay. There's so much divisiveness around, oh my gosh, you want to work with a Republican, you're a Nazi collaborator. And no, if somebody like, Massey wants to end some wars, then he's on my team for that. I'm okay with that. If Ron Paul wants to end some wars, or if Rand Paul wants to end some wars, I disagree with him on a whole lot of things. But if I can work with him to end wars or to free Julian Assange, I'm going to do that. I think that you cannot isolate yourself from people that you disagree with on some things, on these critical issues. We have to be able to have conversations, difficult conversations with people we don't agree with, in order to move things forward. That's the only way that we can get things done. I don't know why that's such a complicated issue. I don't know why that's so difficult for people to grasp.
Well, again, like you're saying, by design, right? I mean, if you mention certain topics, you're branded a white supremacist. And it's just like, wait a minute. Or, like you just talked about, if you have a conversation with a Republican, you might agree on something, then you'll get branded as some kind of Nazi collaborator. And it's just like, wait a minute, where did this come from? And
Mhm.
why is it part of our political discourse? And I agree with you that it's by design, because the more that we separate, then the less power we have to fight the powers that be. The one, and this is the way, like we kind of linked it to the corruption, like we gave the one Russiagate example of corruption, but I'd argue, and we can probably come up with many, many more, where these whole political issues are often cover-ups for some kind of corrupt establishment situation, where they just have it trickle down through their corporate media and then split it into a right-left paradigm issue, and then we're no longer having the conversation about the corruption anymore, because the bottom line is, I think 99% of us all would agree that corruption is not good, and we'd probably stand up to fight it if that's what the mainstream media was talking about, was showing us,
Well, we really don't have two parties. It's not a partisan issue. We have one party.
Right.
On matters of war and Wall Street and national security, those people all work together. They use everything else to keep us divided. And so, they're getting you to fight about abortion and religion and, healthcare and socialism versus capitalism and all of this stuff, while they're stealing your money, stealing your jobs. I mean, they're very good at what they do. And it's very frustrating to me that we can't get more people to recognize the game, because all of those people, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, work together. They pretend like they hate each other. They do not. They're on the same team. And so, they're trying to keep you divided while they buddy up and work together to screw you over. And at some point, it would be cool if people would recognize that and work together to screw them over for once,
I know, it would be amazing. Go ahead, Jesse.
I was just going to add on to what Misty was saying, that it's, as Chris Hedges so aptly points out all the time, and I wish more people would listen to him, this is all symptomatic of the decay of the American empire. And I don't say that in a romantic, revolutionary, or wishful sense. It's material reality. This is what happens at the end of empires. As he says, the system vomits up people like Trump and Joe Biden, who are, we're supposed to be obligated to vote for one or the other, or we better shut up and not say anything about the system because we're not participating in it, which in itself is a fatuous argument. So a lot of it has to do with that conditioning, I think, that, or the guilting even, that you have to participate every 4 years or every 2 years if you want to count the congressional elections. And it's also too that there's, for a while now, been this sort of plague of anti-intellectualism in the U.S.
Yeah.
People don't like to read, or if they do, they don't want to read something that takes them more than 2 minutes to digest. And because of that, they don't have historical knowledge, and they don't have context for why what's happening now, whether domestically or geopolitically, why those things are happening. And when you bring that up to them, this is my experience, when I've brought that up to them and presented facts, for example, why I would never vote for Joe Biden, provide Libya as an example, and cite how Obama, as the first Black president, helped return the slave trade to the African continent. When I tell people that who have already made up their minds that they're going to vote for Joe Biden, they just say I'm cherry picking, or this is my favorite, that's just your opinion.
Right.
It's a matter Trump.
It's a matter
Trump,
of historical record. It's a matter of historical record, but no, it's just my opinion. And then I also get accused of being a Trump supporter as well, which I'm not. But
yeah, I know that.
I think it's almost like a mass psychosis, and I don't want to say that with any sense of inferiority or like I'm talking down on people who are entitled to their own opinions and positions, but it's it's gotten so widespread that,
yeah,
like you mentioned, Doug, it's almost impossible to have a conversation with somebody who's essentially, they've got their mind made up, and there are millions of people out there who actually think Joe Biden is, as a president, will change things.
I think the problem is, though, is those aren't their opinions; they're received opinions. They've
Yes,
been told what to
absolutely.
think, and
Sure.
they are unable to process information in their own way, without any of the bias that's been imposed upon them. It's a real problem. The propaganda in this country is a serious problem.
Yeah, and let's be frank too. These aren't easy issues to grapple with. Issues. I don't like that word, but
He
these
hates
are,
that word.
yeah, fair enough.
it goes back to the cliches of bad journalism, but these are difficult things to think about and to try to process, to try to understand. And a lot of people don't want to do that because it's uncomfortable.
Right.
It's uncomfortable to look at Syria and realize that if you want to do genuine research into what's happening there, you're going to have to look at pictures of dead children, pictures of people who've been beheaded by the US's Wahhabi proxies in
Mhm.
Syria. And I don't blame people. That's hard stuff to digest. But if you're serious about political change and you're not just resting on your laurels and putting your faith in Joe Biden, I think you have to deal with those things. But there's such an aversion to that now, and I think that ties in as well to the age of technology we live in, and convenience and instant gratification. And people would rather, it's easier to leave your house and go shopping than it is to take a day and read about what's actually
Right.
happening in Syria. And I think
Uh,
that's a huge part of the problem, is that it's the time, the effort, the emotional toll it can take on you, people don't want to deal with. And I understand that to an extent, but again, if you're serious about political change, you have to grapple with those things, those hard subjects. And I don't, from my experience, I don't think many Americans are willing to do that, or want to do that, or even want to think about doing it.
Right. I mean, from my perspective, it's like I get it that only a certain percentage of the population is going to nerd out on this stuff as hard as people like us do, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
can, I studied history in school, and I learned how to study history critically, which almost nobody does because they're just fed this history and this, in school. And without learning how to have those kinds of research skills and to be able to kind of doubt the party line and then come to your own conclusion is just something that most people really don't get. So they get this almost, well, I mean, it is a mythology about the history of the United States, and they're taught that it's this free country and we fought these wars for freedom, and it sounds really great. And I think what you were talking about, Jesse, in terms of the mass psychosis and what people don't want to face, I mean, they certainly don't want to face the pictures exactly like you were talking about of the atrocities that are occurring overseas and here in the United States, for that matter, by the system. But what I
Yeah,
think,
let's not forget there are children in cages on the border,
yeah,
separated from their
yeah,
parents,
totally.
kidnapped from their parents, and essentially being tortured.
Sure. Or what's even going on in prisons with the drug war, or, I mean, we could go on and on.
Yep.
But I think what people are really afraid of is to recognize, I mean, for one, that they've been propagandized. Like, they want to believe that the journalists are telling them the truth. This is what I get all the time when I try to explain to people in my community. It's like they don't trust that I've done thousands of hours of research. I've read hundreds of books on these topics, and they don't trust that I'm any kind of an expert because I don't have the little badge that says I work for CNN.
Yeah.
And they just can't believe that all these journalists would be sort of falling in line with this lie, and all these experts. So they trust these people to do the job of journalism for them. And I think that's where the real mistake goes. And you have to actually open people up to the fact that maybe they've been fooled.
Well, I
right?
think
You've
it's
been
deeper
taken.
than that. I think it's deeper than that, because this starts literally from the day you're born. I mean, you are propagandized from birth to think that the
Sure.
United States is a great country, and we're, a world leader, and we're fair, and we spread democracy and all of this stuff. I mean, we have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and every sporting event is a military industrial complex commercial. And I mean, it is ingrained in us from day one. And so while I'm frustrated with people for not being able to see through the bullshit, I also can't blame them, because this is literally a lifetime of brainwashing.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult to break out of. And you're right. A lot of it is probably a sense of pride and, oh, well, I've been fooled. I've been had. I fell for it. And that's hard to admit to yourself that you were dumb enough to fall for this. And I'm not saying dumb enough. I'm just saying that as a person who's recognizing that, that's how you feel, because you're not dumb. The propaganda is very effective. And so, and again, starts from birth. So that's a really difficult thing to overcome. And it's scary to admit that everything you thought is a lie. That's terrifying.
Yeah. Almost everything you were taught in school. That's another place where people can't go. Well, in school, they taught me that this was true, so it must be true. It's like, well, why did they teach you history that way in school? Because they didn't want you to know.
Jesse and I have done a series on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we had a fantastic conversation with an Indigenous historian called Liza Block, who's amazing. And, we discussed how in school we're taught about how the country was founded and and it's all garbage. And founded. And people just don't realize, if you don't know where you came from, how are you supposed to move forward? And so if everything you're taught is a lie, I don't know how you're expected to make anything better. It's a really difficult thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to point out the economic class aspect of this, as in the capitalist system we live under in the US preaches first and foremost hyper-individualism. It's about me. I'm going to do me. No fucks given. YOLO, that whole childish philosophy of selfishness. And I think by default, if you adopt that attitude, which is so prevalent, whether you know it or not, you cultivate apathy within yourself. You cultivate narcissism and nihilism within yourself. And somebody, at the mere mention of the word politics, a lot of people will just be, I still hear it at family functions. Let's not talk politics or religion. Well, why?
Right. Only the two most important topics that in your life that affect your life, other than your relationship.
Yeah. And I think, especially with the, if there even is a middle class anymore, middle class, upper middle class, especially, there's this refusal to look at the issues that are actually in front of them, and they want to maintain their comfort and convenience. And I understand that. I think that's a natural human instinct. But again, these are the same people who will try to moralize voting for Joe Biden to you and scream at you if you disagree, which actually happened to me with a relative a few days ago, and it was one of the most bizarre and sad exchanges I've had with somebody in my family. And I don't know if there are any other contributing factors to that, but I think that capitalism and hyper individuality and the cult of self are very much huge contributing factors to this, to people not genuinely participating in what's happening in politics, what's happening in geopolitics, and especially as pertains foreign policy. I've talked to a lot of people who ask me, why should we care about U.S. foreign policy, as if
Wow.
blowback is, well, first of all, most of them don't know the term or what it means. But I think, again, just to reiterate, a lot of it has to do with capitalism and the cult of self and what Chomsky calls conspicuous consumption. You know, go out and buy your shoes and don't worry about what's happening in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
What was Bush's proclamation or declaration soon after 9/11? We'll go shopping, have yourself a good time. And it's, when you really look at it for what those statements are and what they're encouraging people to do, it's absolutely delusional. It's this sort of inescapable fealty to capital and to economy. And I think that's what primarily drives the US government now. And since the manufacturing base in this country has been essentially stripped to zero besides the arms industry, that's why we're seeing a $754 billion military budget pass with bipartisan consensus. So,
and progressive support.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Progressive.
I wish Americans could understand, even comprehend how much money that is that the United States spends on the military. Like, we could spend half that, still spend more money on the military than any other country in the world, and have an extra $400 billion to do something productive with, you know? It's just,
right.
It just boggles
We could
the
have
mind.
healthcare. We could have free college. We could have free childcare. We could think of the things we could have. And that's not to say, I mean, if you want to go with, you know, modern monetary theory and Stephanie Kelton, we don't even need to worry about cutting any budgets. We can just pay for the stuff. But even if you don't believe in modern monetary theory,
Right.
the idea that we have to spend that much on the military while ignoring all of the issues that we have at home is beyond absurd. And the fact that people go along with this while they're suffering, like people can't pay their rent, they have no job, they can't take their kid to the doctor, they have to decide between their electric bill or their gas bill, and they're still okay with spending that amount of money on dropping bombs on poor brown people.
Yeah, or giving Israel $3.8 billion a year so they can have universal health care and free education, while we can't even wrap our heads around the idea of Medicare for all, which, by the way, Biden supporters, he already committed to vetoing if it comes across his desk. So you might want to take that.
In the middle of a pandemic, that dude was like, I'll veto that shit. Are you kidding me? Oh, unbelievable. Sorry, you guys are getting me riled up and I'm going to start ranting, and that's never good.
I'm always up for a good rant. Well, I mean, this, you know, we should probably go a little bit full circle, though, and kind of stick on the media idea, because then we're back to the way the corporate media is basically creating excuses for the corporate imperialism that we're seeing abroad. I think if we focus, to me, there's many rabbit holes to get into how and what do these rich assholes do to control our society. But the foreign policy one is a great place to start, because it doesn't take too much to kind of crack open that shell and be like, why exactly is the U.S. in Syria right now protecting the oil fields?
Right.
You know, when Trump was saying he wanted to get out of Syria, and there's exactly, completely illegally. Like, can we have a conversation about that on a national level? And nobody in the corporate media is even talking about it. Like, oh, are there some troops in Syria? I mean, not to mention, what's going on in Yemen, or what happened in the Ukraine, or, the list.
Well, remember when it was like this big, like all of a sudden somebody came that we were in Nigeria, and everybody's like, what? What?
Yeah,
we're
right.
in Nigeria? Like nobody knew we were in Nigeria.
Forgot about AFRICOM. Yeah.
It's crazy.
You know. And
yeah,
why?
I think that's important to bring up, the special ops presence in Africa, especially in countries like Mali.
Yeah. Almost every country in the world, but certainly all over Africa. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's it's not good what that is engendering in those African countries. And really, the only journalist I know of who's been doing good coverage on this, and sorry to say he's with The Intercept, but he's still a good journalist, is Nick Durst. So if anybody's looking for more information on that, I would recommend reading his reports. But
remember when you didn't have to preface something with "I'm sorry to say he's from The Intercept"? Those were good times.
Yeah, but that's The Intercept's fault. They decided to hire former MSNBC and New York Times reporters.
Well, unfortunately, you got to follow the money, right? I mean, It goes to big tech money, and that's why, all kudos to Glenn Greenwald and the work that he's done, but the person that owns The Intercept is ultimately the one that can define what's going on, and you've seen this slippery slope into more corporate narratives for sure.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think that if you're a journalist with The Intercept that automatically makes you a bad journalist. Again, I think Glenn Greenwald's an amazing journalist. There's no doubt about it. I follow his work. I think he does excellent work, but by and large, I don't like the content they produced. They've produced, and I'm thinking specifically of this piece Robert Mackey wrote a few years back, comparing, without any evidence, just saying that it was the Assad regime who was doing the bombing, comparing it to Guernica in Spain, and it was this completely hyperbolic.
It was the Syria coverage that got me too. I started reading the Syria coverage on The Intercept, and I was like, "This is corporate propaganda. What are you doing? What are you guys doing?"
Well, let's not forget James Risen and his Russiagating, because that is something to behold.
Yeah, right.
Woo!
That man, I'll say this every time he comes up, he's gotten at least 3 of his sources jailed. Reality Winner, and I'm forgetting the other 2 off the top of my head, but at least 3 of them. And if you watch interviews with him, or even if you read he calls them articles or reports, but I feel like they're more just these turgid opinion pieces. The most important thing for him when he's pursuing a story is that it's a good story, not that it's vital to our interests, to the interests of humanity, or anti-war or anti-imperialism. It's a good story, and I think that says everything right there. And I don't care how many prizes he's won, or if he was himself persecuted by the U.S. government. His work speaks for him, and I think he's a terrible journalist, and I'll put that out there. And I think that he should, more than funding Reality Winner's defense, I think he needs to offer up a much bigger mea culpa than that, maybe even retire from the profession, because if he ever was good, he's not anymore. He's certainly gone to seed, and I don't have any qualms about saying that.
It's interesting because I've heard you guys, you're covering on your program quite a bit, actually, this idea of journalistic integrity, how difficult it is. You're going through journalism school, they're promoting this corporate approach. You get out of journalism school, you want to do the right thing, but if you get a job, I think I heard you mention Tarek Aziz, who was at Newsweek, going like, why won't they let me write the stories that I want to, write? Why are they making me write these narratives that...
Tarek Haddad.
Yeah, Haddad, sorry.
Yeah, Tarek Aziz was...
I do that every time, Doug. Don't
right,
worry.
Sorry.
Tarek Aziz was Saddam Hussein's right-hand man.
Yeah, right.
I forget what his position was.
Haddad. But anyway, you're getting these stories about trying to stand up for your own journalistic integrity. And then, even at a place like The Intercept, what happens? And at what point, this gets back to this whole notion of independent journalism and trying to do it on your own. But this is getting more and more challenging. And I also wanted, with the time we have left, we can talk a little bit about the censorship now that's happening, of course. It's not only do people not listen to us because we don't have the CNN badge or we're not an expert, or we're not towing the party line, and they have their own levels of cognitive dissonance. And I don't know why people don't question, why are they censoring people who are saying that? Why do they censor people who talk about Julian Assange, you know? I mean, the scariest thing about what's going on right now is that I hear people that I went to college with and people in my community that are all right with censorship. Oh, that source was Russian disinformation. We're glad they got kicked off YouTube. I mean, I hear
Listen,
that.
we have
I'm like, are you
progressive
kidding?
leaders like AOC
Mhm.
advocating for Mark Zuckerberg to censor people on Facebook.
Right.
It's complete insanity.
Hopefully he
That's not a
censors her
progressive
first.
position. What? I'm sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
I said hopefully he censors her first.
I know that's not going to happen, though. That's the thing.
Right.
And it's incredibly frustrating because, we have these people advocating for censorship and knowing AOC is not an idiot. And she has to know Bernie Sanders is not an idiot. Cenk Uygur at Young Turks is not an idiot. They have to know that this will come back to bite the left on the ass. It always does. Censorship, they start with people who are despicable and universally despised, like Alex Jones, because that's the manufacturing consent. And once they have people okay with the idea of deplatforming and censorship, then they can do it to anybody. And that's how that works. And it's absurd to me that we have people proclaiming to be progressive leaders advocating for this kind of thing. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it starting to happen with the hate speech. And then they'd say, well, like, for example, if you complained about Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, well, you're engaging in hate speech. And so you could see that one coming down the pike. Then they made a big deal about the Sandy Hook thing, like you're talking about, which whatever you think about wild conspiracy theories surrounding Sandy Hook, and Alex Jones got nailed for that, but that was in the national news, showing people exactly what you're saying, taking the farthest outlier and getting people used to the idea of censorship. Because Alex Jones is crazy, right? He needs to be censored. Oh my God, he's saying crazy stuff. And now, I mean, it's happening to a lot of people. Del Bigtree's show got taken down off YouTube. And like we talked before, The Last American Vagabond and Derek Rose's sites last week. So, I mean, they're starting to drop like flies here before the election. And as the vaccine rollout starts to happen with the COVID. So we can't have an actual conversation. And nobody's thinking to themselves, why? If it's so obvious that these people are crazy, why do you have to censor them? Like what's going on?
Right. And or why even broach the topic of censorship? Just don't listen to them.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I'm a grown ass adult. I don't need Mark Zuckerberg to tell me what I can and cannot see and what I should and should not think about what I can and cannot see. Yeah. That's crazy. I'm a 38-year-old woman. I can handle my own my own shit. Thanks very much. I got it. It's so stupid.
And the people who censor individuals like Alex Jones, they don't realize that what they're doing is exacerbating the problem as opposed to removing a problem, whatever they deem the problem to be. They're normalizing censorship, as we've said, and they're also driving into consumers of media, this idea that if you hear something that even sounds a little far-fetched, just because it's out of your normal,
right,
what you normally hear, then it's a conspiracy theory. So you could tell somebody that, so for example, with regard to Libya, one of the jihadis who was sponsored by the UK, he was sent there to help depose Gaddafi, which happened. And then he was sent back to the UK with I believe it was an MI5, MI6 visa. They let him back in the country freely. This guy then later walks into the Ariana Grande concert and blows it up with a nail bomb and kills over 70 people. And it's, when you tell people that, they're like, well, I never heard of that. I don't know about that. And it's a matter of historical record. It's not something I don't even see how you could construe that as an opinion. It's a declarative statement of fact. So there's just so much resistance to dealing with the harsh realities of what the US does. And people want, again, if people want their comfort and convenience, which is understandable. I think that's, I studied Marxism in college, and, Marx has said that that's part of what we require to fulfill ourselves as human beings, and along with creative work and meaningful relationships, etc. But people don't want to do that, or it seems they really don't want to conduct that critical analysis anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, is trying to coax them to do so without proselytizing. And that's really hard, because again, once you bring up something that's indisputable, like the Manchester bombings connection to Libya, which most people don't know, it's the immediate thing, because they've been conditioned about, with regard to the Russiagate stuff we talked about earlier, and other propaganda campaigns through the mainstream media. It's like anathema, like they can't touch it. It's like you're handing them a lit stick of dynamite. And
I used to engage, just like I spent a lot of time comparing and contrasting the corporate media with the independent media before. I was like, wow, this is a waste of time, because the corporate media is pointless to listen to, frankly. I used to spend a lot of time like on a local listserv, trying to work in my community to see if I could wake people up. And right about the time that the Syria thing was really heating up, I guess it was right after the ISIS propaganda had kicked in, and they were starting to invade from Iraq. And at the time, this primary source had come out from one of the higher level meetings, Department of Defense meetings, or with the president, where they were having a conversation about what they were planning on, how they were planning on fomenting this, like as you described it earlier, this Wahhabist revolution that could then be used to help. And they're helping these people, and it said something about how certain actors in the area are concerned that this might, cause this Muslim revolutionary movement to try to take over. And then it literally was basically saying, like, we've decided that this isn't an issue for us. We don't mind if that happens. I was having the conversation about Syria, like why, they're pumping ISIS as the biggest evil while they're funding ISIS behind the scenes, so that then they can justify a U.S. invasion in Syria. I'm trying to explain this. He's calling me a conspiracy theorist. I show him the primary document, and he won't respond to it. And then I was finally like, what about this thing? And he was like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And it was like, that's when I realized, like, I was wasting my time on this whole forum. Like, these people they don't care about primary source documentation. It's it's seriously the brainwashing that's the biggest issue. And that's what, I'm starting to do interviews about cognitive dissonance and why people can't perform critical thinking. What's going on? What is going on? Because we can't win this information war if people literally can't look at the primary documentation that's evidence right in front of their face that shows them what's going on. And if they can't even see it, how do we change things,
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up too, because WikiLeaks has a 100% record of accuracy. They've never gotten anything wrong.
Right.
And yet they're demonized, and people hate them. And, they hate Julian Assange. They call him a traitor and all these other crazy names. And what I find most amusing right now is that Donald Trump likes to complain endlessly about fake news. And yet he's prosecuting the only guy with a 100% record of accuracy.
Yeah.
Check your hypocrisy.
Yeah, right.
You are a turd. Like, what is wrong with you? I think a lot of the problem with, people not wanting to see source documentation, I think it's because, like you said, cognitive dissonance, they don't want to see reality. They don't want to know what's actually going on. They like the lies. The lies are comforting to them.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. I don't know how we combat that, to be honest with you, other than just, constantly talking about it over and over and over again, and just trying to get through to people. And it does work. Like Jesse has said, he's spoken to his parents and they've changed their mind. Nils Melzer Nils Melzer bought into the propaganda.
Right.
He did not even want to look into the case. But then when he forced himself to do so and was confronted with evidence that, contradicted his, current held beliefs, he did what every human being should do. He changed his mind.
Do you want to explain? Explain that
about
story.
Nils Melzer? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Nils Melzer is a UN Special Rapporteur on torture. And, the Assange team had been trying for some time to get him to take a look at his case. And try to get the UN's support in getting Julian released. And he was very hesitant to look into it at first. He was not interested. He bought into the propaganda. He, kind of had a bad feeling about Julian Assange. Didn't want to do it.
Yeah, there's no way they're torturing someone in England. My God, the bastion of freedom.
Right. But he finally decided to force himself to look into the case. And when he did, and he, saw the actual evidence of the Sweden case, for example, he's Swedish and fluent in Swedish. Mm. So he was able to read through the police reports, and he was able to examine all of the evidence and looking at all of the other evidence against Julian Assange and for Julian Assange and all of those things, he realized that he had been had. He had been fooled. And he talks about this at great length. And there are a couple really great articles that he has out that he goes into detail explaining his thought process and how he ended up changing his mind. And I'm not even kidding you. I have an immense amount of love and respect for that man, because when he first came into the Assange movement, I was in a pretty dark place where I thought that it was hopeless. And then here comes this guy who was presented with evidence and changed his mind. And I thought, okay, we can do this. We can change people's minds. And so, he was pretty instrumental in me even sticking with my Assange activism, because, and that's not, me being ridiculous or dramatic. Genuinely, I was over it. And then he came out and he's now one of our, most valuable and most vocal supporters. And, if he can change his mind, we can get anybody to change their minds. We just have to keep at it.
It's so true about so many issues, and it's actually challenging to do this kind of work that we're doing, because how do you not get depressed sometimes when it's like, what's going on with the vast majority of people? I think the forces behind imperialism, I see, there's a direct lineage that goes straight back to the feudal lords of Europe. These guys have been conquering the world for the last 600 years or so, and they're good at what they do, and most people don't even know they exist.
And I don't think those systems of economic and political repression have gone away. They've just gone into new forms.
Absolutely.
So, for example, the debt peonage that journalism students, for example, are forced into.
Everybody.
Because you have to pay an insanely exorbitant amount to go to Columbia Journalism School. And then what are you going to do to pay off that debt? Are you going to go work for an independent news outlet, or are you going to go work for a corporate one where you're going to be obviously paid more? And
I don't think people understand how powerful this debt servitude actually works. Doctors and our healthcare system is exactly the same way. These guys get out of school, they have $250,000 in student debt. You think they're going to buck the system on, hey, I found this $10, cure, when the pharmaceutical companies are pushing a $10,000 cure,
Well, and it's the same way with our legal system. If you get out of law school, you're going to go become, some high, if you can, are you going to do, environmental law? Or are you going to go be a defense attorney?
Right. I think that, I've interviewed Ellen Brown multiple times from the Public Banking Institute. I think that and this is again, an issue that nobody would ever even know about, but the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system, it guarantees a level of poverty. We're creating money out of creating debt. There's only, in terms of the people that create the currency, there's only incentive to get people deeper and deeper into debt. And then, exactly like you're talking about, then there's this whole slave system that develops where once you're $100,000 in debt, well, you have to get the corporate job. And that's where it's so frustrating to talk to all these people that say, well, Doug, you're not an expert, because I'm listening to the guy at CNN because he's an expert, or the doctor in the lab coat, and they're not all going to fall for this conspiracy. They're telling the truth. This is a good system. And it's like, no, they're all doing their jobs, just like everybody was doing their jobs in Nazi Germany, right? I mean, I get it. Everybody's not a horrible person who's involved in the imperialist takeover of the world, or but they have debts, and they got a car payment, and they want to send their kid to school, and they need health insurance. I mean, my God, you got a corporate job at CNN. If you toe the party line, you can make six figures. If you complain, then you're down here with us trying on Twitter to distribute your stuff because you're shadow banned on YouTube. I mean,
yeah.
What do you think is going to happen?
I think I'm not going to make a prediction, or I'm not saying this is my prediction, just theory based on what I've been witnessing over the past few years, but it's going to get worse in the media. I don't know what's going to happen next week with the election.
Right.
I think we all of us who are paying attention have this creeping feeling that something is not going to go right.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you guys read the article that Whitney Webb did about the election integrity project?
I don't think that it's a theory, Jesse. I think that this is they're manufacturing chaos.
I'm saying it's a theory because I don't want to be. Again,
I'll say it.
Doug, Doug, as you were saying, Doug, like, people will say you're not an expert. Most people, I think, by rule of thumb, who call themselves experts are not experts. So I think we can just dispense with that title. It's
Sure.
about what you know and about presenting the facts. But
well, that's just even
Go
where
ahead.
did the idea of the expert consensus, we could go there. It just drives me nuts. Oh, the consensus of experts says this, so I'll just not apply my own critical thinking, and I'll just believe the consensus of experts because they must be true. And it's like, well, first of all, I can find lots of experts who disagree with that consensus. So I don't think it's actually a consensus. Where did that term even come from? Maybe we could go into the meme warfare, the WikiLeaks Vault 7. Where did that term?
Well, I think
drives me nuts.
You're mentioning that brings up a good point, and that has to do with the use of language in journalism.
Yeah.
We talked about narrative, which is just as important, but it's the use of language as well. And it's been it's degraded and mutated since at least the start of the Bush Jr. war on Iraq, and the changing of the U.S. military code to the Warriors Code. The soldiers are now referred to as warriors, and there's the cliches that journalists just lazily defer to. For example, if 30 Palestinians get sniped to death at the Great March of Return protests, it's not that they were massacred by Israeli occupation forces, it's that clashes happened. Or I think my favorite one is that they walked into the bullets. And it's this manipulation of language that underpins the manipulation of narrative, and that's a huge problem, especially when you consider it along with the fact that people don't like to read anymore. People don't like to sit and immerse themselves in a history book or even a novel anymore. And we're losing historical context because of that, and we have stupid terms cropping up now to replace historical context, like whataboutism, and you can see the degradation in the language. And I think that
absolutely.
It's like how the Department of Defense used to be the Department of War,
right?
And it's all in its framing. Like it's part of that propaganda. It's how they can manipulate you. And how whenever they want you to go along with whatever they're saying, the first thing out of their mouth is something that will strike fear, because then your lizard brain kicks in, and everything else that comes after that is heard on a different level. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
So, I mean, there are these tactics that they use to manipulate people, and it's like I've been saying, it's very pervasive and they're very effective. It's a problem, and I honestly don't know how to combat it. I wish I had the answer to that.
When I remember when Vault 7 came out and WikiLeaks revealed the Vault 7 leaks from the CIA, and one of the things that was described was this meme warfare division. And every time I hear something like the word fake news, or, these memes that arise and suddenly become part of everybody's vocabulary, I wonder, like, did that come out of some room in the CIA somewhere? Are they manipulating our language to this extent? And then every journalist, like you're saying, Jesse, every journalist starts to use this kind of language. I've heard in some of the journalists that you've been talking to, this whole idea of self-censorship. Like, I used to have a show on our local radio station, and I had to watch, what I said. So I know exactly what that feels like, and I know that these guys do it. And I was a volunteer. I wasn't even getting paid. I can only imagine the pressure, put on somebody who is making a decent salary and has to pay off their student loan. I mean, what are you going to do? You're
even great journalists like Aaron Maté have fully admitted, in an interview with Jimmy Dore, he fully admitted that he does self-censor because he has to worry about his job. He has to worry about that aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And it's really unfortunate. And I think that, I've talked about this on multiple shows, but my biggest issue with independent media and why it's been so disappointing to me is that, yes, they're not funded by corporations, but because they are funded by viewers, they end up self-censoring because they know that they have to appeal to the broadest base of people in order to get clicks and subscriptions and Patreons. So, whether or not it's intentional, these people who are in independent media who have now made this, their way of living, mm-hmm. They are now self-censoring themselves and dumbing down their content because they don't want to offend anybody, and they don't want to, I have been fighting with independent content creators on covering Assange for a very long time. And it's unbelievably depressing that I have to fight with people to cover a historic court case on press freedom, people who consider themselves in the news media, people who consider themselves journalists or content creators or analysts or whatever. I shouldn't have to beg these people to cover it. And yet here I am begging people to cover it. And that's something I don't know how. That's why, Jesse and I have talked about this. I don't ever want to worry about subscriptions or money or donations or sponsorships ever, like that. That's not why I'm here. It's not why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And I understand to some extent that people have to make a living, they have bills to pay, but once you make that your living, it's almost inevitable that you're going to start censoring yourself because you have to bring in a big audience, or you want to bring in a big audience. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to what I believe is a truism, that if you go into anything with a profit motive, you're not doing it genuinely. Mm-hmm. That applies to journalism, that applies to music, writing, any kind of creative endeavor. And as just to re-emphasize, or to emphasize what Misty said, it's true. These people get their slick shows and they get, tens of thousands of subscribers, and all of a sudden it's about keeping their base, so to speak, as opposed to providing useful information about which we can make decisions on what's happening in the world and how we want to conduct ourselves and try to make the world a better place. And it's, again, I'm not a Marxist, but I think that a lot of what he theorized applies here. And it's the capitalist system that eventually pervades and perverts these, probably what start out as honest attempts to provide an alternative source of media, but it comes down to the money in the end for a lot of these people. And you don't make money if you're questioning what happened in Duma. You don't make money, mm-hmm. if you who even reports on Yemen anymore?
I know, right?
You don't make money from that. And I think that as long as that continues, journalism is just going to get worse and worse, even independent journalism. If you look at the independent outlets that are out there right now, so few of them are any good. I'll point to the Gray Zone as one of them, as one of the, I think, best ones that's out there. And I think that not only because of the content they put out, but because in speaking with Max, he's expressed to me that he doesn't give a shit if it pisses off whomever is exposed or whichever politician has a vested interest in backing a proxy war or a coup in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't care. He's willing to take the risk. And unfortunately, most journalists aren't willing to do that. They'd rather be in the White House press pool and be called on by their first name and have access to power as opposed to monitoring and criticizing the power.
And even a lot of these independent journalists, I mean, they're susceptible to the propaganda too, if they're not really on guard. I mean, the anti-Assange propaganda was so heavy. I saw a lot of people, even people whose opinions I would typically respect, they didn't want to come out publicly in support of Assange, especially after the rape allegations, right? I mean, it just nailed him. And you talked to one.
Seymour Hersh, in an interview not too long ago, said he won't go near Assange. He considers Assange kryptonite or something. It was a really
right.
For Cy Hersh, who I think is an amazing journalist.
Sure.
It was a really bad metaphor, and I was quite surprised to hear him say that. And I brought that up in past interviews, past shows, and I think it bears repeating because it shows how even somebody like him, who's exposed so many important stories, can be susceptible to the fear mongering. In this case, around Julian Assange.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a little bit of his hesitation probably has a lot to do with the fact that recording came out with him discussing WikiLeaks source. He was pretty bothered by that. But I mean, I've had the people at Action for Assange, I will say, our group, we have had independent content creators straight up tell us they won't cover Julian Assange because they're worried about getting deplatformed, they're worried about getting demonetized, they're worried about losing subscribers.
Right.
I mean, they'll just straight up admit it. I mean, I don't want to name names. Normally I would, but I'm trying to be nice. So, the Julian Assange thing to me is so frustrating because of the fact that these people don't seem to understand that they're coming for you next.
Right.
This doesn't end with Julian Assange. And if you think that you're safe because you don't talk about Julian Assange or whatever, you're not. They're coming for all of you, every single one of you. If you do not toe the line, if you are not Rachel Maddow 100% on board with the corporate propaganda, they're coming for you too. And it's just really short-sighted. I've never seen a group of people shoot themselves in the foot so just willingly. Just like, hey, I'm just not even going to bother with this. It's crazy.
Sure. Yeah. And I think in that context, although it's not, well, I think as an anti-imperialist that you have to take an internationalist perspective. And I think you probably can find connections between these two different happenings, but the police murders that are taking place in the United States, it's like you'll watch these videos of police officers murdering Black people, Hispanic people in broad daylight, and there's still this liberal coastal elite pushback of, well, not all cops are bad, it's just a few bad apples. Well, why does it keep happening then if it's just a few bad apples? It should be an anomaly, or in my opinion, the police shouldn't exist at all, but that's a different conversation. And there's sort of this complacency, this acceptance of, well, we need the police, and it's going to happen, and that's that. And but I do think that, again, this is cliche, but the tide is turning in regard to police brutality. I think more people are becoming aware that they are nothing but violence workers. They have no business responding to a mental health crisis. They are armed to the teeth with military grade weapons. They go on their little exchange excursions to Israel and get trained by not the IDF, the Israeli occupation forces, and they come back and they deploy those tactics on American citizens, on George Floyd, on protesters, and people see that and they get it, and they don't like it. But again, not to harp on history and historical context, but I think a big part of it has to do with that. It's a lack of knowledge of how police were even invented. You know, they were invented to repress people who were occupied in Northern Ireland under John Peel. You know, the Bobbies, or sorry, Robert Peel, the Bobbies. And when something like that has an origin of repression, of violence, it's only going to perpetuate that. It's not going to reform itself. Reform is a myth. And
you know, this is such a big issue because one, I don't think we can even have a conversation without talking about decriminalizing drugs and ending the drug war, because that's the root of so much of the violence. And then two, though, now we have this whole private prison industry that's got millions of people in prison that are counting on those millions of people in prison. So they're fighting, you know. So it's just like this, again, a never-ending spiral, a cycle of violence that's happening where, you know, the more violent the police are, then, you know, the more people they throw in jail, and the more the people are profiting from the people going to jail, and they're pushing for harder drug laws. And then there's more drug laws, and the police have more of an excuse to come in, you know?
yeah,
And as long as there's incentivized, as long as there's money in it, then people are going to keep doing it, and including the militarization of police, selling all the weapons to the cops. So.
Yeah, and I think an important conversation that's not really happening is, how do we really push back? How do we really fight back against this state-sponsored violence? I'm all for marching and protesting and standing in solidarity with other people, but what does that do in the end? The last protest that I went to for George Floyd, of all the protests I've been to, it was the most heavily policed one. Every block there was an officer stationed in an SUV monitoring the people going by to make sure that they didn't rightfully express their anger or get out of line. And
the last protest I went to, about an hour after I left, a cop car drove through some protesters.
Wow.
So, you know, like it's,
and I don't, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because I don't advocate for violence, but when you're dealing with such a violent system, how are you genuinely supposed to fight back when they have a monopoly on violence? I'm not saying that we should just walk out and shoot police officers, but we have to start defending ourselves at protests and hitting back, I'll say. And I'm sure that's gonna get me a visit from the FBI, but it's true.
Well,
if we're really serious about changing this, that's at least a conversation we need to have, and nobody's really having it. And I get why, for the reason that it's controversial, it's provocative, it's a dangerous conversation to have. You're talking about defending yourself physically against state sanctioned violence, and the Weather Underground tried to do that, and I think they were successful in the sense that they really made the American imperial apparatus afraid. And people don't know this, but all the bombs they planted were in empty buildings. They weren't trying to target people or kill people. It was trying to send a message, though, that we're fed up with this and we're going to start hitting back. And I'm not saying that that's the approach we should take, but it's got to be more than just marching and going home and feeling good about ourselves. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but right. I think again, going back to anti-imperialism and taking an internationalist stance, I think it ties into what's happening to Julian Assange as well. And if he's extradited here, why don't we show up at the airport and rescue him? All this power that we're talking about is arbitrary. None of it is set in stone. It's not gospel. And we, as human beings who care about other human beings, we deserve to fight against that violence. And again, I'm just saying this is a conversation we need to have if we're serious. And I think Martin Luther King broached it. Malcolm X certainly did, Fred Hampton, and you see what happened to them. They were all assassinated. So it's dangerous, but I don't think anything's going to change if we don't at least have that conversation. I'm not saying that's the route we have to go, but we have to consider that when the state has this huge monopoly on violence, as Zach De La Rocha sings in a new Run the Jewel song, how can we be the beast when the beast is going to reach for the worst?
Yeah, it's certainly frustrating. I mean, and we could even have a broader conversation about protesting in general, and what does that actually ultimately achieve? It seems like the system, I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, what was it, 2004, at the Republican National Convention, there were 4 million people in New York protesting the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And there was just nothing. Nobody cared. In fact, the corporate press barely covered it. It was amazing to me. And the anti-war movement's it's just over now. Like the wars are still going on, right? Anyway,
and just to tack onto that,
yeah,
there's no anti-war faction whatsoever in the U.S. government anymore. There's bipartisan consensus for the military budget, for perpetual aid to Israel, for all kinds of militarized operations, including domestically with police. There's nobody standing up to it. You get token gestures from Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna and a few others, but I don't think they have the backbone or even the heart to really fight for that. They want to preserve their careers first and foremost. And I think that's what the U.S. government has become. It's just a warehouse of careerists who think they have the right to make decisions for us. And I don't see it improving. I don't think there's going to be a candidate in the future that's going to change anything. And it's up to us to collectively decide how we want this to change, what we want the future to be. And there's no reason why we can't do that. Again, all this power that is granted to government, to police, to the military, it's arbitrary. It's not set in stone. We don't have to accept it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think people need to really actually realize the most important thing is to really stop believing in the authority of these people that have overextended their legitimate authority, And the more we can get people to just don't believe these guys anymore, then the more possibility for change. We're starting to knock on 2 hours, so maybe 10 minutes left in the show. I've been trying to wrap it up on a positive note. It's been difficult, so let's see if we can do it. We got 10 minutes.
Oh goodness! Think of something positive, Jesse.
Yeah,
that's not
quick.
My area of expertise.
I know.
Well, let's if we can talk about the upcoming presidential election. What are your?
That's not positive.
Yeah.
What the hell, dude?
I don't know. What do you want to talk about? Coupons or something?
I guess, maybe like what is it that as independent journalists, I mean, where can independent journalism go to really kind of turn the tide here? I mean, what do you see? Like, what are you guys trying to do with your own podcast, right? And how can we maybe just brainstorm how to kind of break through some of these brick walls and get people to start paying attention, especially maybe at least to the censorship, at least to the Julian Assange issue.
Right.
Yeah, well, the Julian Assange issue, I will say this. There has been kind of a positive shift. There are a lot more people paying attention than there were previously. So, I mean, there is some movement there. It's slow. It's a very, very frustrating mission.
Yeah.
But, we are getting to the point now where I am getting a ton of feedback on Twitter. And, I'm talking to people in my community and getting positive feedback from them. The biggest thing people can do for Julian Assange is talk to people. And I'm not even kidding. I will talk to anybody. I talk to the guy that does my hair. I talk to my shrink. I talk to my parents.
Right.
I talk to anybody who will listen to me. So, and I think another big thing that you can do is participate in direct action. Even if you're like the lone crazy person on the street corner holding a free Assange sign, go do that. If that's what you can do, go do that. So, the Assange thing is a very, it's hard to stay positive when you're involved in this movement. It's a really, it is David versus Goliath. So it is a very difficult thing in order to remain positive. But I think that it's a fight worth fighting. And so even if it's hard and it sucks and it's, I take a lot of shit all day long. But in the end, it's worth it. This is, like I said before, this is literally the front line of all of the other fights that we face. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as far as independent media goes, like Jesse and I have said, when we first spoke and, we're kind of trying to figure out if we would be a good fit together to work together on a show. One of the first things that came out of both of our mouths is we don't want to focus on, doing the easy stuff. We want to cover topics that don't get covered, that are hard to cover, that people don't talk about, and that, deserve more coverage. And so I know that's a hard thing to do, especially if you are somebody who is in independent media as your source of income, which, I mean, that's a whole other topic of discussion, but
challenging.
I mean, it is. And, we talked to our friend Sam, and he's somebody that went to journalism school, and, he talked about how it is very, like, you are indoctrinated in journalism school. It is not a legitimate journalism school. You are corporatized and, just force-fed, propaganda. And so, he's done incredible work about contacting different journalism schools, the deans of journalism schools, to try to get them to make statements on Julian Assange. And, these are all things. Anybody can do something. You can do something. If it's, emailing or calling your elected representative, which I don't really think that does much good, but it is something you can do. So, it's a really hard thing to be positive about, especially when you're a cynic like me. Sorry.
Yeah.
See, that's why I was trying to get Jess to be positive, and then he brought up the damn election.
Well, I certainly agree that trying to be positive is a good thing and what we should strive for, but just looking through the lens of a materialist lens, as Marx would, I just don't see any hope for things getting better. I just see every day it's more and more deterioration. And that's not to say that we collectively, what we're doing with our work or what we're trying to do, that we can't eventually make a better world for us to live in. I'm just saying the way things are going, if we, the general we, just let it keep going as it is and don't push back, it's the best situation I think that we'll end up in is a former empire like England, like the UK, and then we'll be, some other country's lapdog. And, we didn't even talk about like this huge pivot east toward China and Russia that countries are making economically and politically. Maybe we could talk about that another time, but I think, and this is not just platitudinal, or it's not even a hope or something that I think is cool or romantic, but I think the American empire is ending. It's in its terminal phase of existence as an empire. And we're seeing all the symptoms of that with the supposed choices we have for presidents, with police murdering people in broad daylight in the street with impunity, with this like pathological aversion to intellectualism, to even just sitting down and reading a book. And again, I'm not trying to be like Mao with a cultural revolution, or I don't want to be a leader or tell anybody what to do. These are just my observations. But unless we really start to make some substantive moves, which I think that would be something we have to collectively discuss and decide what they are, but nothing's going to change if things as they are. I think are T.S. Eliot said the bottom is a long way down. I think we're quite near the bottom, but I don't agree that negates trying to fight back against it and make things better, to inform people in a positive way, in a non-confrontational way. And it might sound new agey, but just treating people well in common circumstances, whether it's the delivery person who shows up at your door with your food, or you accidentally bump into somebody in the grocery store. Just empathy is what it boils down to. And it's not something the US empire, I don't think it even knows the definition of empathy anymore.
Sure.
But that said, I think I'll quote Samuel Beckett in terms of the fact that we have to keep fighting and resisting. He wrote in a poem, "I can't go on, I'll go on." So the only thing to do is to go on and keep fighting and do the best that we can. And again, I think try to keep empathy in major focus as we're doing that, and not preach to people or make them feel like they're stupid or that we're some kind of shamans with the answer. Just to inform them what's going on, what they may not know. And if they're resistant to that, that's their choice. And all you can do is walk away. You told them what's up. So
right. Yeah, I'm getting to the place where, kind of the Derek Bros freedom cell idea, where I get my 8 buddies together and we just figure out how to make it if the shit hits the fan, like it's just up to us. I mean,
yeah, Steve and Sleepy Josh and I are going to move to Murder Mountain.
Nice. That's where I am actually. I'm close to there. I'm in Mendocino County, so just so you know,
good deal.
we could hang out
Steven.
together. You could be in my freedom cell. Yeah.
Nice. I'm into it.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Murder Mountain's in Humboldt, correct?
It's in Humboldt. Yeah, it's just a little farther north from here.
I watched a documentary on that not too long ago. I think it was called Murder Mountain.
Yeah.
Actually,
it's infamous now.
Yeah.
The cannabis business really isn't that rough, guys. I mean,
yeah,
gets a bad rap. Anyway, I've lived here for a long time, so
yeah.
I guess we should wrap it up with that. I mean, that was the positive note that we get. So our listeners will
good job, Jesse.
Leave with that one. Yeah, we'll we'll fight harder.
I don't mean to end it on I think
I hear you.
If I could distill my message, it would be, we must keep fighting, doing what we're doing,
That's what Julian says. Keep fighting.
Trying to spread information and also not immediately seeing people as enemies if they disagree with you. I think that's easier said than done, and I think we're all guilty of doing that. But it's going to take a lot of thought and a lot of effort. But if you,
I think it's so important that we learn how to work together. I mean, this is the thing that's the division has really got to stop. I mean, I don't know how exactly to do that. I try to talk about decentralization so that, differences within your community, you can work out with your community. I don't know that we need to have these larger national world level conversations about how things need to work. That's kind of my solution, because we have got to stop. There's no way, especially right now, if the division is as bad as it is right now, I mean, we're just giving the rich guys all their power by fighting with each other. So,
right.
So anyway.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos is somewhere up in his Elysian bubble, not even thinking about us. So they don't care about us. They don't. And I think the sooner more people internalize that and take action on that, the better. But again, it's about getting information out there and
waking people up.
Yeah, and about getting the information out there too. And I think it's good to be passionate. You should be passionate and genuine about what you're expressing. But again, you don't want to get up on your soapbox and scream at people and tell them you should do this or you should do that. And that never works. And it's very easy to devolve into that with everything that's happening now. But again, we just got to keep fighting these maniacs who want to control our lives, make decisions for us that have nothing to do with us, but everything to benefit them and keep them in power.
Well, it sounds like a plan, guys. Do you want to let people know where they can find more about Facts on the Ground? Is it the YouTube channel? You guys have a website or anything else? What about Twitter?
We have a Twitter account. It's at FOTG Podcast. And I'm on Twitter at Jesse Zurawell, my name. And Misty is on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust, which is a great name.
Yep, nice.
And
well, my mom, because we're all made of stardust, right? And I'm very sarcastic, and so my mom told me that whatever star I came from was a sarcasm star. So
nice.
That's where that came from.
Kind of has a
end on that story.
Carl Sagan vibe to it, which is cool.
Yeah.
Right.
And we do have a YouTube channel. There's a link to that on our Twitter page, and also I know it's on my Twitter page. Misty, I think you.
I don't know if it's on mine. I'm so bad about that shit.
Okay, right. Yeah, it's on mine. But if you go to YouTube and search for Facts on the Ground, it comes up in one of the first searches. So
cool.
Yeah, you can find us there, and we're also we're happy to speak to anybody who wants to talk to us and who's in this. I hate saying fight because it's such like war language, but who's in this fight with us. And so I just want people to know who see this, don't be afraid to reach out, and we're happy to join our comrades wherever they may be, despite whatever little differences we might have. So if you feel so inclined, please don't be afraid to get in touch with us. We won't bite.
Sounds good. Yeah.
You might.
We'll keep your eye.
Kind of an asshole.
Well, cool. Do you have any last words you want to say, Misty, or are you good to go? Did that cover it?
No, I don't think so. Just thanks for having us on. This was great.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it,
Doug. And I recommend to your viewers or to people who watch this who don't know about your show, definitely tune in, because
right on.
It was a great discussion, and again, thank you for having us on.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Take it easy. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was my conversation with Misty and Jesse of Facts on the Ground. I've really been impressed and happy to see a lot of these new independent media outlets coming out, a lot of these new podcasts coming out. They've interviewed a lot of younger journalists just getting out of journalism school, or really having conversations about how pro-corporate it is in journalism school, and how difficult it is to get out there as an independent media outlet, get your word out, and start having these actual conversations, evidence-based conversations that aren't confused by the propaganda and the misinformation that's coming out of the mainstream. I think one of the favorite parts of the conversation we had there for me was when Misty was discussing, in terms of the action for Assange, really trying to get away from the left-right paradigm entirely, trying to have conversations where you're not identified as one side or the other, but we're actually needing to transcend these petty arguments and personal attachments, and really have the capacity to have some rational conversations and some respectful debate about what's going on in the world, where we don't just get caught up in this divide and conquer tactic that clearly has been preventing the people from being able to really take a position of power against these corporate oligarchs at the top of this hierarchy, as we discuss the 5 major media corporations that now control 90% of everything that you ingest, all the news that you're listening to, and the amount of control that just a handful of people really have. A lot of what I've been going through lately is realizing the danger of what happens. We discussed this a little bit too, this debt slavery that everyone's in. They need to pay off their student debts. These journalists coming out of journalism school, they've already been essentially indoctrinated with a pro-corporate attitude, and then they have to pay off their student loans. So they need to get a good job, and then these people are just doing their jobs, writing copy, what the editors are telling them to write, the narratives the editors are telling them to write, and of course the editors are just passing along the information from the corporate owners. And so these narratives are constructed. There's not really investigative journalism going on unless you're looking at independent media, where they're not tied into this. And yet the problem gets even deeper. I was trying to end the conversation on a positive note. It was actually really challenging because you have self-censorship happening even in the independent media, because people need to make a living. They have subscribers. They can't get too far outside of that Overton window, because so many people are influenced by what they're hearing in the corporate media that if you get outside of that corporate window, all of a sudden you must be a Russian propagandist, or even a white supremacist. It's just outrageous how these labels have been given to people that speak outside of the approved narrative. We've got to start focusing on living in a free society, having freedom of speech. And I'm just really happy that people like Misty and Jesse are actually promoting this. I think the Assange trial has been a rabbit hole for a lot of people to ask themselves, why aren't the corporate media really covering this? And when they do, why aren't they concerned about the impact this is going to have on their own jobs? Why aren't we talking about the freedom of speech implications here? Why aren't we talking about how the U.S. government apparently feels like it can go anywhere in the world if someone reveals war crimes, arrest the person, and then persecute them and literally torture them? We talked about Nils Melzner a little bit in the discussion, coming to it from a place where he was like, oh, I think Assange must be being treated fairly. He's in England. It's not like a third world country, and then going and actually witnessing the extreme damage, the psychological and physical torture that's being done to this guy, just because he revealed war crimes and embarrassed a certain group of people that don't like to be called out for their criminal activity. So I just really want to give a shout out to those guys. This is the 3rd interview discussion that we've had now about this Assange trial. But I think this one really stood out because we did much more of a meta-analysis, not just about the trial itself, but really a meta-analysis about the state of independent journalism in general, and brought up a lot of concerns. I mean, we're dealing with severe shadow banning and censorship at this point. Multiple channels on YouTube just last week got taken down. They continue to step up the censorship. Personally, like my favorite news sources, I can't get them on YouTube now. We're all having to go to other smaller social media platforms just to try to get the word out. And I'm starting to feel concerned that, we really need to get away from even trying to convince those that are convinced the mainstream narrative is correct, and just start preaching to the choir and start organizing together, because what's coming down the pike is getting more and more scary. We talked a little bit about the election. The Lost American Vagabond just yesterday, and Whitney Webb has been doing a lot of work talking about this Transition Integrity Project, which is running simulations, gaming what happens if Trump wins, what happens if Biden wins, and then either one of them say, well, we're not going to concede the election, and then it just goes downhill from there, with scenarios literally ending in military takeovers, or severe changes to the democratic process, and a reduction of any kind of real democracy that's happening here in the United States. And some of the stuff that they're revealing from these simulations are starting to come out in the mainstream media now. So it's just becoming a really frightening situation. And so I really appreciate that there are people like Misty and Jesse out there that are promoting an independent perspective and trying to get the word out and doing the best they can. The interviews they've been doing, especially with the younger journalists, are well worth the listen, and I hope you all take the time to check it out. You can find their stuff at The Facts on the Ground on YouTube. They have a YouTube channel, or go to @FOTG Podcast on Twitter. And then you can also get the rest of my stuff, The Shift with Doug McKenty on YouTube and Facebook. I'm on Twitter @DMcKenty. And you can find my website, www.theshiftnow.com. Of course, I'm going to give a shout out to Rob Rubin as well. He has produced these roundtable discussions for Transparent Media Truth, and you can find out more about him and all of the roundtable discussions either on YouTube at Transparent Media Truth, on the web at transparentmediatruth.com, or on Twitter at transparentmed1. If you want to get in touch with Rob directly, that's the best place to go. I just want to remind everyone, as we discussed, the shadow banning and the censorship are very real. We're having a difficult time distributing a lot of this information. So if you like what you're hearing, please click on that like button or the subscribe button, and most definitely share it, because we're relying on listeners like you for the distribution for this information at this point, because YouTube and Facebook and the rest of them aren't really gonna do it for us the way they might have 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. So I want to thank everybody again for listening, and we'll be back around. We've got another one coming up next week. I think we're probably going to take December off. It's looking that way. And a little bit of November. We'll have a few more episodes, and then we're going to take a little break. But really appreciate that you've been listening, and I'll continue to have my stuff up on theshiftnow.com and on The Shift with Doug McKenty, where you can also find all the roundtable discussions. So thanks again for checking this out, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. The opinions and ideas expressed in this roundtable discussion do not necessarily reflect the views of Transparent Media Truth, but only those of the speakers participating in the discussion. Under the copyright disclaimer within Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowances are made for fair use of public content for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.